While setting the table for my in-laws' anniversary dinner, I walked past the guest room and heard my wife say, "He's just a stepping stone. Once the papers are filed, I'm set for life." Her younger sister whispered, "Smart. Clean him out before he catches on." I finished arranging the plates and smiled through the toast like nothing was wrong. 3 days later, her lawyer reached out, but by then, it was too late. I, 34 never imagined that setting the table for my in-laws' anniversary dinner would be the moment my entire world shifted on its axis. The dining room looked perfect. Crystal glasses caught the evening light, the good china gleamed against the mahogany table, and fresh flowers from our garden made everything feel warm and inviting. My wife had been planning this celebration for weeks, insisting everything had to be flawless for her parents' 40th anniversary. I'd spent the afternoon preparing their favorite dishes while she handled the decorations and guest arrangements. The house buzzed with quiet anticipation. Family members had been arriving throughout the day, and the guest rooms were full. My wife's younger sister had flown in from California. Her parents were staying in the master guest suite, and various cousins and aunts had claimed spots throughout our home. It felt good to host such an important milestone, even if the preparation had been exhausting. I was making my final adjustments to the place settings when I realized I'd forgotten the cloth napkins upstairs. The guest room where we kept the linen closet was just down the hall from where my wife's sister was staying. As I approached the door, I could hear voices from inside, my wife and her sister, speaking in hushed tones that immediately caught my attention. What I heard next stopped me cold. My wife was explaining how I was essentially just a stepping stone in her larger plan. Once the divorce papers were filed, she'd be set for life. Her sister's response was even more chilling. She praised the strategy of cleaning me out before I could catch on to what was happening. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand still reaching for the door handle. The words echoed in my mind as if they were bouncing around inside an empty room. My wife of 7 years, the woman I'd built a business with, bought a home with, planned a future with, was discussing my destruction like it was a chess move. The conversation continued, and I learned more details that made my stomach turn. They discussed timing. Apparently, the papers would be served right after the holidays to maximize the emotional impact. My wife mentioned how she'd already documented everything she could think of to strengthen her position. Bank accounts, business records, property deeds, even photographs of items in our home that she could claim as solely hers. Her sister congratulated her on her patience, noting how smart it was to wait until after my business had its strongest year before making her move. They talked about the house, about the vacation property we'd bought last year, about the retirement accounts I'd been building since before we even met. Everything was apparently fair game in her mind. I slowly backed away from the door, my legs feeling unsteady. The hallway suddenly felt too narrow, too warm, too suffocating. I made my way back downstairs, forgetting completely about the napkins I'd gone to retrieve. The next few hours were surreal. Family members arrived for dinner. Hugs were exchanged. Compliments flowed about how beautiful everything looked. My wife played the perfect hostess, her arm linked through mine as we greeted her parents at the door. She introduced me to relatives I hadn't met before as her wonderful husband who'd made all this possible. During dinner, her father made a toast about the importance of commitment and partnership. He spoke about weathering life's storms together, about how marriage required trust and dedication from both people. My wife squeezed my hand under the table and smiled at me with what looked like genuine warmth. Her sister raised her glass and added her own words about finding the right person to build a life with. I smiled and nodded at all the appropriate moments. I laughed at jokes, refilled wine glasses, and played the role of devoted husband and son-in-law perfectly. But inside, every word felt like glass cutting through me. Every knowing glance between my wife and her sister felt like another layer of betrayal. Later that evening, as we cleaned up together, my wife thanked me for making the dinner so special for her parents. She talked about how much it meant to her that I'd put so much effort into making everything perfect. She mentioned how lucky she felt to have someone who understood the importance of family. The next morning, I woke up with absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. While my wife slept in after the late night, I drove to my office and began making phone calls. My first call was to my attorney, a sharp woman who'd handled my business contracts for years. I explained the situation and asked her to recommend the best divorce attorney she knew. By afternoon, I was sitting across from someone who specialized in protecting assets during divorce proceedings. We discussed strategies for documenting everything, protecting my business interests, and ensuring that any settlement would be fair rather than the financial execution my wife apparently had in mind. The next 2 days were a masterclass in discretion. I maintained my normal routine while quietly gathering documentation of everything I could think of: bank statements, business records, property documentation, even photographs of valuable items throughout our home. I opened a separate bank account and began moving money in ways that would be completely legal but would prevent her from draining our joint accounts without notice. My attorney worked quickly to understand the full scope of our financial situation. She helped me realize that my wife had been positioning herself strategically for months, possibly even years. Small changes to how she handled paperwork, subtle shifts in how she discussed our joint assets, even her sudden interest in understanding my business operations, it all made sense now. On the third day after the dinner, exactly as I was reviewing asset protection documents in my office, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the caller introduced himself as my wife's attorney. He was calling to discuss what he described as an amicable separation that would benefit everyone involved. I listened as he outlined their initial proposal. It was exactly what I'd expected after overhearing that conversation. A settlement that would have left me with almost nothing while allowing my wife to claim the majority of assets we'd built together. The house, the vacation property, half of my business, and a significant portion of my retirement accounts were all on their list. When he finished his presentation, I thanked him politely for the call and told him he should expect to hear from my attorney soon. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. He asked if I had retained counsel, and I confirmed that I had. He seemed surprised, noting that most people in my situation prefer to handle things more informally at first. I explained that I always believed in being thorough when it came to important decisions. After ending the call, I immediately contacted my attorney to let her know the game had officially begun. That evening, my wife was unusually quiet during dinner. She seemed distracted, checking her phone more frequently than usual. When I asked if everything was okay, she said she was just tired from all the family activities over the weekend. But I could see something had shifted in her demeanor. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, she brought up the idea of taking a vacation together soon. She mentioned how we'd been working so hard lately, and maybe it would be good to reconnect somewhere relaxing. The timing of this suggestion, coming just hours after her attorney's call, wasn't lost on me. I agreed that a vacation sounded nice and suggested she start looking at options for spring. She seemed pleased by my response and began talking about places she'd always wanted to visit. But I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the way she was measuring my reactions to everything she said. Update 1. The next few weeks were like living in a carefully choreographed performance. My wife continued playing the role of loving spouse while I maintained my part as the unsuspecting husband. But both of us were working behind the scenes in ways the other supposedly didn't know about. My attorney had been thorough in her preparation. We'd documented every asset, every account, every piece of property or valuable item that might be disputed. More importantly, we'd identified several significant advantages in my position that my wife's team apparently hadn't considered. The vacation property, for instance, had been purchased entirely with inheritance money from my grandmother, money that had never been commingled with our joint funds. My business, while grown during our marriage, was structured in a way that protected it from being considered fully marital property. And several of our joint accounts had been funded primarily through my income, with clear documentation of those contributions. Meanwhile, my wife's behavior became increasingly telling. She began asking subtle questions about my business operations, wanting to understand details she'd never shown interest in before. She also started taking pictures around our house, claiming she was thinking about redecorating, but actually documenting items for her eventual claims. Her sister called frequently, always when I was supposedly out of earshot. But our house carried sound in ways my wife had forgotten, and I began understanding the full scope of their strategy. They weren't just planning a divorce. They were planning what they believed would be a complete financial conquest. 3 weeks after that first phone call from her attorney, my wife finally brought up the subject of our marriage directly. She sat me down one evening and explained that she'd been thinking about our relationship and wondering if we'd grown apart. She used all the standard language about needing space to figure things out and wanting to separate temporarily to gain perspective. I listened carefully to her entire speech, nodding at appropriate moments and asking the kinds of questions someone hearing this for the first time might ask. When she finished, I told her I was surprised but that I wanted her to be happy. I suggested we could try counseling first, but she quickly dismissed that idea, saying she thought we were past the point where talking could help. She then mentioned that she'd already consulted with an attorney, just to understand what separation would look like practically. She assured me that she wanted everything to be fair and amicable, that there was no reason for things to get complicated or expensive with legal battles. I thanked her for being honest with me and told her I'd need some time to process everything. She seemed relieved by my calm reaction, probably thinking her strategy of presenting this as a mutual decision was working perfectly. The next morning, I called her attorney back. When he answered, I informed him that I was aware of my wife's intentions and that my legal representation was ready to proceed with formal proceedings whenever his client was ready to file. The confusion in his voice was obvious. He asked how I knew about their plans, and I simply told him that my wife had discussed her decision with me directly. He seemed flustered, mentioning that they'd hoped to handle things more gradually. I explained that I appreciated directness and saw no reason to delay the inevitable. If my wife wanted a divorce, I was prepared to proceed immediately rather than dragging things out unnecessarily. Update 2. The formal divorce proceedings began 2 weeks later, and it quickly became clear that my wife's legal team had been operating under several critical misunderstandings about our financial situation. Their first major surprise came when my attorney filed documents demonstrating the separate property nature of several assets they'd planned to claim. The vacation property, in particular, was completely off limits due to its inheritance funding. Business valuations revealed that while the company had grown during our marriage, the majority of its value was tied to intellectual property and client relationships that predated our relationship. But the real shock came when bank records revealed the full extent of our financial picture. My wife had apparently been operating under outdated information about our account balances and investment holdings. Several accounts she'd planned to claim contained significantly less than she'd expected, while others she hadn't known about contained much more. My attorney had also uncovered some interesting details about my wife's own financial activities. It turned out she'd been quietly moving money for several months, presumably preparing for her eventual departure. But those moves had been documented, and they actually strengthened my position by demonstrating premeditated planning on her part. The discovery process was particularly revealing. My wife's sister had apparently been involved in the planning for over a year, providing advice and even financial support for the legal consultation. Text messages and emails revealed the depth of their scheming, including discussions about timing the divorce to maximize financial impact on me. When my wife's attorney requested a settlement conference, my attorney agreed immediately. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at a neutral location downtown. I arrived prepared for what I knew would be a very different conversation than the one my wife was expecting. My wife walked in with confidence, flanked by her attorney and her sister. She dressed professionally but warmly, probably aiming to project reasonableness and approachability. Her attorney had prepared a presentation folder with their settlement proposal, which he placed prominently on the conference table. The proceedings began with their formal presentation. They outlined their position on property division, spousal support, and asset allocation. It was essentially the same proposal they discussed that night in the guest room, a plan that would have left me with minimal assets while transferring the majority of our wealth to my wife. When they finished, my attorney thanked them for their presentation and began outlining our counterproposal. The room's atmosphere shifted dramatically as she methodically dismantled each of their assumptions about our financial situation. The vacation property was off the table entirely due to inheritance documentation. The business valuation supported a much smaller marital interest than they'd projected. Bank records showed contribution patterns that favored my position significantly, and the evidence of premeditated planning actually supported claims of financial misconduct on my wife's part. My wife's face went through several distinct changes during this presentation. Initial confidence gave way to confusion, then concern, and finally something approaching panic. Her sister whispered urgently in her ear several times, clearly realizing that their strategy had been based on incomplete information. But the final revelation was the most impactful. My attorney presented evidence that my wife had been systematically hiding financial information and moving assets in preparation for the divorce. This behavior not only undermined her claims of wanting an amicable separation, but also opened the door for sanctions and additional penalties. When the presentation concluded, my wife's attorney requested a private consultation with his client. They left the room for nearly an hour, and when they returned, both looked visibly shaken. The final settlement they accepted was dramatically different from their original proposal. I retained the house, the vacation property, my business interests, and the majority of our joint accounts. My wife received her personal property, her own retirement accounts, and a much smaller portion of our shared assets than she'd planned. More importantly, the settlement included provisions that prevented her from making future claims against my business or any inheritance I might receive. Her attempt to position herself for long-term financial security at my expense had not only failed, but it actually left her in a weaker position than if she'd simply asked for a straightforward divorce initially. Update 3. The final papers were signed 6 weeks after that settlement conference, and my wife moved out immediately afterward. Her sister had flown back to California the day after the meeting, apparently no longer interested in providing support once the financial conquest strategy had collapsed. The house felt different with my wife gone, but it was a relief rather than a loss. For months, I'd been living with someone who saw me as nothing more than a financial target. Now I could begin rebuilding my life with people who valued me as a person rather than an asset. My business partners, who'd been quietly concerned about potential disruption from divorce proceedings, were relieved when I explained that my interests were fully protected. We began planning expansion projects that had been on hold while I dealt with personal uncertainty. The vacation property became a retreat where I could decompress and plan my future. Sitting on the deck my grandmother had loved, looking out at the lake she'd enjoyed for decades, I felt connected to something more permanent than the temporary partnership I'd just escaped. About 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into one of my wife's cousins at a coffee shop downtown. She mentioned that my ex-wife had moved back in with her parents temporarily and was working part-time while trying to figure out her next steps. The confident woman who'd planned to be set for life was apparently struggling with the reality of supporting herself independently. Her sister had apparently distanced herself from the situation once it became clear that their scheme had backfired. The family members who'd celebrated our marriage at that anniversary dinner were now dealing with the awkwardness of maintaining relationships with both of us after such a messy ending. I felt no satisfaction in my ex-wife's struggles, but I also felt no guilt about protecting myself from her planned financial destruction. She'd made her choices based on greed and deception. I'd simply refused to be the victim she'd counted on. 6 months later, I started dating someone new, a teacher I'd met through a business networking group who was involved in financial literacy programs for young adults. She had her own career, her own goals, and her own sense of financial independence. When she learned about my divorce, her reaction was sympathy for what I'd been through rather than interest in what I'd retained. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on genuine compatibility rather than strategic positioning. She met my friends and family as herself rather than as someone playing a role for future advantage. The contrast with my previous marriage was striking and healing. A year after my divorce was finalized, my ex-wife's attorney contacted my attorney about a possible appeal of the settlement. Apparently, she'd found new legal counsel who claimed to see opportunities for challenging the original agreement. My attorney reviewed their preliminary arguments and determined they had no merit. The settlement had been thoroughly negotiated and properly documented. More importantly, any attempt to reopen the case would likely expose my ex-wife to additional scrutiny of her pre-divorce financial behavior. The evidence of premeditated asset manipulation had been damaging enough in the original proceedings. Reopening that investigation would probably make her situation worse rather than better. Her new attorney apparently reached the same conclusion after reviewing the case files. We never heard from them again, and the settlement remained final and binding. Looking back now, I realized that overhearing that conversation in the guest room was one of the most fortunate accidents of my life. If I'd remained oblivious to my wife's plans, I would have been completely unprepared for what she intended to do to me. Instead, I was able to protect myself and ensure that her scheme became the catalyst for her own downfall. The anniversary dinner had been meant to celebrate 40 years of partnership and commitment. Ironically, it became the beginning of the end of my own marriage, but also the beginning of my escape from a relationship that had become a carefully planned deception. My in-laws never learned the full details of why our marriage ended so suddenly after their celebration. I saw no reason to destroy their relationship with their daughter by revealing the extent of her planning and manipulation. But I sometimes wonder if they suspected that the perfect evening they'd enjoyed had been the backdrop for something much darker. Today, I'm building a life based on honesty rather than strategy, surrounded by people who value authenticity over advantage. My ex-wife taught me valuable lessons about protecting myself without meaning to, and I'm grateful for that education, even though I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone else. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be the victim someone else has planned for you to be.